we're about to talk now about Hong Kong in the context of its broader region of the Greater Bay Area. So I think it's important discussions on the capital market infrastructure that Luan just raised that we're going to talk about now. So I'd like to invite my panelists to the stage. Peter Burnett, Managing Director of Standard Chartered, Daniel Chan, EVP of HSBC. Online we have Manjian Chen, Managing Director, Bank of China International, and we also have He Jie, who's Director General of the Shenzhen Municipal Financial Regulatory Bureau. Please join me on the stage. And I'm just checking you can, Manjan, I'm checking you can hear us okay. Possibly not. Manjan, do you hear us okay? Jess, I'm not sure if our virtual speaker can hear us, so just want to check on that. Mr. He will also speak in Mandarin. So if you are an English speaker who can't speak Mandarin, which includes me, then you'll need your simultaneous translation. Thank you very much for joining me. I want to ask some very basic questions, first of all, about the Greater Bay Area. Very simply, perhaps starting with you, Daniel, on this, what is it? What is the Greater Bay Area? How would you define it?
Thanks for passing me the first question, because probably my title got GBA on it, so I get the first question. I think we all along been understand very closely about like Guangdong or Pearl River Delta. I think Greater Bay Area actually include 9 cities in the Pearl River Delta, as well as Hong Kong and Macau. We use Bay Area. Actually, the world have 3 other Bay Areas. We have New York Bay Area, we have Tokyo Bay Area, and of course Silicon Valley, San Francisco Bay Area. I think it's quite unique for Greater Bay Area because we have basically all the key components of all the other successes in other Bay Area. Like New York, obviously, is financial. Silicon Valley, San Francisco is technology, and then advanced manufacturing in Tokyo Bay. So we have all the 3 components here. So making it very kind of, the biggest opportunity, I would say, among all those. Right now, we're ranking 3 in terms of GDP. Actually, the GBA GDP is comparable to Korea and Canada. So, we're expecting to grow from 1.8 trillion to 4.6 trillion by 2030. So it's a 2.5 times increase. So huge opportunity from an economic growth angle. Population 86 million, target to grow to 100 million. Despite it's only 5% of the population in China, is actually contribute to 11% of GDP. So also the per capita GDP is very high. So it's also a good ground for wealth management opportunity because you have a lot more high net worth individual in this area.
Thank you. There's plenty to explore, both in terms of the economic and industrial and investment hinterland and capital markets, and indeed Hong Kong's role in that. And we'll come on to explore that. Peter, perhaps you can explain to us the rationale behind treating this area as an integrated economic zone.
Sure, thank you. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for including. I don't have GBA in my title, so I'm not sure I'm really qualified to speak to any of this, but I'll have a go. I mean, my qualification, I suppose, goes back to the fact that I've been in Hong Kong for 27 years, I think. And so I've seen this concept grow and develop. And Hong Kong has always had a role as a kind of connector with for the mainland, whether it was in goods or whether it was finance, going back really to its, to its inception. But the most recent development, I suppose, was the creation of the Closer Economic Partnership Agreement, which was completed in 2003. And that actually is still relevant today, actually, for many of the activities in GBA. But that acted as the beginning, as the impulse, if you like, which has led to the Greater Bay Area. And so, what was the Closer Economic Partnership Agreement? Well, it was designed to focus on what was then called the Pearl River Delta, what we now refer to as the GBA, broadly speaking, the same geographic area. And it was a building block approach to introduce trade and economic liberalization on a continuous basis. So there were 4 key areas. It was trade, trade in goods, trade in services. Investment was also very important, and economic and technical cooperation. So there were a number of segments, areas of expertise, which were a focus area to improve and promote trade and investment, like consulting. So that has developed into what is now the GBA. And what is the vision for the GBA today? Well, it's a kind of cluster city, if you like. So it's a megatropolis, as we've just heard, with these 9 cities and 2 special administrative regions. And the idea is that it should be economically integrated and a world-class business hub. There should be, often you see in the description of the GBA, this reference to it being a quality living circle for living, working, and traveling. So it's not just about economic integration, it's also about people integration, and a support for the Belt and Road Initiative. So what are the cluster effects? The cluster effects are that it attracts investment because you've got that expertise. It attracts talented people. And we'll go back. You mentioned the population there, Daniel. In fact, the population statistics are actually even better because this area of China has one of the youngest populations as well of the whole of China. So, and is growing very, very rapidly. So less than 10% of this population is older than 60 years old, which compares with something like 15% for the rest of China. And it's growing and it's young. So it attracts young, talented people. It encourages innovation. It encourages learning. 5 Hong Kong universities have set up campuses in the GBA. And it provides access to finance.
Perhaps a little later, we'll explore a comparison you made earlier between the GBA and initiatives to create what became the European Union. Perhaps we might come back to that comparison later. It was quite interesting. Mr. He, thank you again for joining us from Shenzhen, now a 15-minute train ride away, I believe. Tell us, please, what the GBA represents in the economic strategy of China.
刚才2位讲者已经提到 GBA 的人口 GBA 的总量，有一个中央文件里面有一个提法叫4合3级，大湾区9个城市啊，包括珠三角有9个城市，但是有核心城市有4个啊，香港、深圳，还有这个广州和这个珠海，还有一个3级的说法。3级一个是广州佛山是吧？第2个是深港，第3个珠澳。毫无疑问，深港合作这一级是最为重要的。像今年疫情恢复以来，我到香港已经是第4次了。现在我们目前这个人员的交往的恢复非常快，大概在我们曾经突破了深港之间啊，有10几个口岸，已经突破了60万人次，是吧？像今天我是第1次坐高铁啊，尽管高铁通了很多年了。来也非常方便，到香港这边啊，要经过3道手续，大概10分钟，然后高铁本身14分钟，所以2个巨型城市这么联系这么密切，在全世界是绝无仅有的，并且在世界知识产权组织这几年的全球的创新指数的排行中，都把香港、深圳、广州，后来把广州加上了，就全球这个区域里面，它的创新指数排全球第2位，仅次于东京和横滨。所以这一块是非常有活力的啊，本身地理上联系也是非常密切的。当然，我们有一个最好的一个点就是前海，是吧？中央是吧？几部委大概在2个月前专门发布了前海，前海的全称就是深港现代服务业合作区，是吧？有30条，这里面有很多内容都可以下一步有很多机会啊，有很多工作可以做。
Thank you, Mr. Hay. Could tell us which economic sectors in particular the GBA focuses on?
现在深圳跟香港联系越来越密切，是吧？包括我们政府之间，包括各个部门之间，这个没有任何障碍。包括我跟香港财库局局长，对吧？一年要见若干次面，通话有若干次，都很多问题都在进行探讨。包括今天会议结束以后，我还要去香港经发局，是吧？谈谈其中前海30条里面还有里面专门提到深港要联合举办金融论坛，是吧？这个论坛到底怎么搞？今年我们想有一个突破啊，在这个怎么进行合作，大的一个合作机制啊，这个事儿也谈到很多年了。当然，前海30条里面也提到深港金融创新委员会怎么进行组建，所以很多工作现在我们都在紧锣密鼓的进行开展。当然呢，我们现在看的最多的还是各种通，跟我们金融有关的啊。大家看，现在目前有6个、7个通，是吧？什么深港股票通，是吧？通了已经7年了。是吧？现在目前深港通的交易金额已经突破了65万亿，这是资本市场双向开放的一个重要的窗口。第二个是跨境理财通，从21年10月份以来啊，到目前为止大概4月份吧，目前跨境理财通开户有5万人，是吧？金额大概突破了34亿，但是目前还不是很理想，所以在制度上下一步还要进行进一步的完善，是吧？第三个是债券通，债券通现在目前已经服务了36个国家和地区，超过3500个国际投资机构加入了债券通。我们还有私募通，是吧？刚才我也碰到那个陆登迈啊，那个在上海设的公募基金的咱们的刘宋总裁，是吧？他也在上海也开那个科 FLP， 我们深圳现在科 FLP 已经有186家，是吧？还有 QDIE 各种管道，这个有关私募还有乌匪啊，做一级市场和一级半市场的这种管道也是非常多的。当然还有 ETF 通。目前纳入沪深港通的交易机制里面 ，ETF 已经达到了102只，当然香港方面就大概有5只，相对少了一点，是吧？还有保险通，就咱们经常驾车啊，到内地去，是吧？可以发现在这个深港澳，是吧？3地车险1地投保，现在目前有10家财险公司。开展了跨境车险业务，还有6款跨境医疗产品和58款大湾区的专属重大疾病的保险，这些都已经推出来。当然，今年大家也看到还有2个重大突破，是吧？港交所那个双币啊，人民币港币双柜台交易这种模式已经出来了。当然，还有一个利率互换通也在开展。所以这种金融的互联互通啊，这个进展非常迅速。当然，我们可能下一步还要开展。大家很关注，都是专业人才的互认，在某些方面有一些突破，在某些方面咱们看能不能通过推动监管机构以一个简易的方式来进行开展跨境的职业啊。
Thank you very much, Mr. He. Manjan, hopefully you can hear me. I wanted to ask you, Mr. He has just touched on it. I wanted you to talk to us about the development of the capital markets ecosystem in the Greater Bay Area, incorporating Shenzhen, Hong Kong, and other cities. How will that look in capital markets terms? Which facilities will reside where?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, we can.
Yeah, I'm sorry I cannot be in the meeting in face. So I think Dr. He has already gave a very detailed analysis about the connection between Shanghai and Hong Kong and the Great Bay Area. Actually, I want to give one argument is that, like what Dr. He said, the financial market integration is a major target during the development of a Great Bay Area. So by deepening the cooperation between Hong Kong and other cities, particularly in Shenzhen and Guangzhou, the financial markets can enhance cross-border cooperation in investment, talents, and technology. So in the system, in the unique system, we usually set by one country, two system, and 3 currencies. The financial market integration in Great Bay Area could also deepen the connection between domestic and international markets, as well as promote the reform of all-round opening up of China, we believe. If you look at the history of past several years, we can see the Chinese decision maker continue to initiate and I think give a strong support to the opening up and the reform in the Great Bay Area as the pilot area for the whole China's continuing opening up. The Chinese decision maker have issued some specific policy for the two-free zone. That is, Dr. He has already mentioned Qianhai in Shenzhen and Hengqin in Zhuhai, which have further deepening the regional reform financial cooperation. Particularly, we noticed that the Qianhai, the Hengqin reform proposal actually gave a very big, I think, autonomy for the regional governments to make the reform. Even I think regarding some reform for the capital market, capital account opening up in these specific regions. So I would like to make some summarize our observation for the achievements of this integration in the Great Bay Area. First, the Great Bay Area has been promoting the orderly mutual interconnection of capital market through a series of connector program. Of course, the famous connector program is the stock connector program. There is a lot of numbers. I think everybody here are very familiar about this stock connection program. I just gave a very simple numbers. By our statistics, domestic investors now can invest in more than 560 stocks in Hong Kong Exchange, which about 25% of the total Hong Kong listed companies. In the first half of 2023, the average daily turnover of Hong Kong Stock Connect through both Shanghai and Shenzhen, of course, was Hong Kong $34 billion. 34 billion Hong Kong dollar, which is about 50% of total Hong Kong Exchange turnover. So the number is very big. At the end of April 2023, for the official statistic, in terms of the cross-border wealth management connect, so this is another, I think, very important connector program that the government gave a big push, make also amazing progress. About 38,000 investors from Hong Kong and Macau, and nearly about 13,000 investors from Guangdong has opened their account.
Thank you, Manjiang. That's clearly rapid growth taking place here. Daniel, tell me what further developments you'd expect in the infrastructure, both real and digital, between Hong Kong and other areas of the GBA.
Well, I think as a lot of speakers already mentioned, that I think right now in terms of transportation, that infrastructure has been well built, but there are further development in connecting with like Zhongshan and Zhuhai, so that I think the people, money, and all the flow will be increasing with that. But I think it's more important. We didn't talk too much about the challenges as compared with the other Bay Area. Is that we are in the Greater Bay Area. Actually, we have 3 jurisdictions. We have 3 currencies, and more than one.
How does that work?
So I think the challenge right now is more of the soft kind of network. I mean, how do we actually overcome some of those challenges? For example, like data flow, because there is national security concern, obviously, This kind of concerns happen everywhere, but I think that's also a challenge when we have that. And also different, for example, when we talk about Wealth Management Connect, the different investor behavior also between northbound and southbound. So there's quite a bit to learn. So I do echo what Eddie mentioned earlier this morning, that we need a lot more pilots and then learn from it, and then hopefully move quickly forward. And I think one very unique opportunity for GBA is designated to do quite a bit of those pilots. Wealth Management Connect right now is the only and the first scheme for retail investor. I don't think it will stay with Guangdong for a long time, but I think we are given a chance to pilot something which is to the retail investor. And likewise, I think for Insurance Connect. So I think how do we overcome these challenges together with the authorities on both sides, with the very important agenda going forward?
Thank you. I'm sure that's true. Peter, tell us about how Hong Kong's role as a financial centre will develop in the context of the GBA.
Sure, that's the agenda for this whole conference, isn't it?
Essentially, yes.
Yeah. Okay, let me have a go. Look, I think that Hong Kong's function as a financial centre for the GBA has actually developed very significantly over the last few years. And, you know, Hong Kong has really established itself now as the preeminent offshore financing hub for China, and also as the link between the rest of the world and China. So just give you a couple of statistics. If you look at investment, I'm told that 84% of all inward investment into China comes through Hong Kong. 75% of all inward investment into China, so the first statistic was GBA, into China is 75%. And the reverse is about 54%. So China going out to the rest of the world routes its investment through Hong Kong. And that gives Hong Kong a very special role. And it's there because of the systems, because of the institutions, because we have a free capital account, because we've got, you know, great financial services, because we have the rule of law, because we have accountants and consultants. This is a built out sector which is very difficult to copy anywhere else in the world, frankly, and it serves the mainland and it serves the rest of the world. And Hong Kong has always been a great aggregator and allocator of capital. So it attracts capital in and it knows how to deploy that capital. It's a great risk management center, if you like, and it will continue to do that. And the GBA gives it the pretext to expand its role in that geographic area, an area which, you know, those of us who have lived in Hong Kong for a long time and you know, very familiar with, and the cultural affinity is certainly there as well. So I think Hong Kong's role as a financial center within the GBA is greatly enhanced and, you know, massively improved over the last few years.
Which services do you think will cluster where? So Shenzhen also has a wealth management sector, of course. It has its own banks like China Merchants Bank and so on. Hong Kong, of course, has its obvious roots in finance that you've just talked about. How do you think these services will distribute between these major cities?
So I don't know if this is the question that Daniel has sort of partly answered, insofar as that Hong Kong is going to be the financial center, Shenzhen will be the technology center, and, you know, the rest of the GBA clustered around Guangzhou will be the advanced manufacturing center. So that mirrors New York, Silicon Valley, and Tokyo.
Right.
But then there's another concept, which is the concept of dual circulation, which some of you have probably heard about as well. And Hong Kong is right at the center of that. So the financial services offered in Shenzhen are, for the most part, domestic. They are, for the most part, serving the community and the businesses and the corporates in Shenzhen and in GBA, and maybe a little bit further afield. In Hong Kong, we have an international role. So we are responsible for the other leg of that dual circulation, which is the offshore RMB, but not only, also offshore settlement in US dollars and Hong Kong dollars, investment and trade. And that's, we heard about it, and you've got a panel later. That's where Enbridge comes into its own.
Yeah. In other words, so Hong Kong will remain the conduit for capital to move in and on and offshore, whereas Shenzhen, you think, will focus as an onshore focused centre. I think we'll say. Good. Mr. Hu, I wanted to ask you about the specific opportunities for external investment routed through Hong Kong, as we've heard, in and around the Greater Bay Area. What are the real assets and industrial sectors that are interesting outsiders?
深圳跟香港现在都在打造财富管理中心，大概我们也计算了一下，去年给中国内地大概理财规模，然后不包括房地产，不包括自己投资委托第三方资管机构进行投资的规模大概是125万亿，而深圳的资管机构呢，大概管了26.5亿，占了全中国的大概1/5强。所以我们现在也提出我们未来发展的4大中心里面要成为国际财富管理中心，所以老百姓的收入到一定阶段以后，可能也要进行全球的资源的配置这是一方面。第二方面呢，大家可以看到这些年来，我们提出大概12年了，战略性新兴产业的发展，7大战新产业，真正是经济增长的新旧动力在快速切换之中。目前7大战新产业占深圳 GDP 的比重，去年是多少？41%，在中国各城市里面是最高的。所以我们看到深圳很多产业非常起来了，都起来了。包括3月底我去到中东的主权基金对中国对深圳都特别感兴趣。大家可以看到，我们深圳的新能源汽车以比亚迪为代表的这一个产业链已经非常成熟了。比亚迪前年的收入2100亿，去年是4200亿，对吧？卖了187万辆，不卖燃油车了。今年会增长一个什么速度？那目前像6个月数据基本上出来了，大家也可以看到发展速度非常快。包括第二个相关的产业，电化学储能，这对绿色发展、对可持续发展，全球都很关注。储能产业在深圳已经崛起了。当然，深圳传统在7大战新产业里面发展最快的、在全球最引以自豪的叫 ICT 电子信息，那是深圳的强项。大概所以这个什么以华强北为代表的，大家可以看到，所以这些新兴产业崛起以后所以就诞生了很多机会，所以也吸引了国际资本，是吧？我们也欢迎国际资本在深圳来进行方方面面的进行一个投资。深圳现在把7大战新产业细化为20+8，7大产业细化为20个产业，再加上8个未来产业。未来产业包括量子信息，是吧？包括深海、深空，是吧？包括这个合成生物这些产业。所以这里我们深圳每一个产业都要求有一个母基金来进行扶持这些产业的壮大。所以现在也有一些学者在研究我们土地房地产大概这个土地财政怎么去转化为股权财政。地方政府所谓股权财政，靠地方政府拿一部分钱跟社会资本一起来融合，然后来培育一些新兴产业，产生一个新的经济增长点，对吧？这里面也欢迎社会资本、欢迎外资一起来。比如说我们深圳的电化学储能基金，大概计划规模就是200亿，也需要外资也欢迎外资的介入，因为深圳投资机会非常非常多
谢谢。Thank you. Man Jiang, you started to talk a little earlier about the Connect programs that allow outsiders to access Chinese capital markets. Could you go into a little more detail about those and about programs like QFI that allow international investors to gain access to assets in the Greater Bay Area that are onshore?
Sure. Actually, I think the Great Bay Area continued to encourage these foreign investors, to be registered in the Great Bay Area. Based on our statistic, we noticed that during past several years, the financial corporation has been encouraged to continue to set up their branches in the Great Bay areas. For example, I I can give you some numbers. Sorry.
We can come back to later, Manjiang, if you like.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll come back a bit later.
No, I can give you these numbers.
Okay.
Yeah, the policy also encourage Hong Kong institutions to get some qualifications of qualified foreign limited partnership. Usually we call it QFLP, and qualified domestic investment enterprises, also called QDIE. By the end of April 2023, 57 QFLP funds has been set up in Shenzhen, with a total fund size of about $7.5 billion. This also, suggested a very rapidly opening up to the foreign investors.
Thank you, Manjiang. Daniel, this is something that we've heard elsewhere in many OMFIF events. So despite some of the geopolitical headwinds, and we talked a little bit about those earlier, there remains a pronounced interest in gaining access to the continued growth of the Chinese economy. And this, I'm sure you're seeing as well through your operations at HSBC.
Yeah, we continue to see those interests. Obviously, the pandemic has paused a little bit in terms of the interaction, but I can see a lot more kind of foreign delegates going into China, in particular into the Guangdong area earlier this year, exploring different opportunities. And I think it's also back to the point about dual circulation. So I think GBA, in particular Hong Kong, have an important role of bringing this FDI into China, either directly or through whatever connect schemes indirectly, but also enabling a lot of China enterprises to get the financing and go international. I think the very strong theme that the central government has put forward this year is economic growth and high quality economic growth. And that is achieved through a couple of key things. First, the internal circulation, the consumption internally, but also development of some of those very important tech or broader sense of tech development. And that's actually accounted for 40% of the Guangdong economic growth right now. And this intention to grow it to beyond 60% by 2035. So again, this will be an important part which can better leverage on the financing support which Hong Kong can play in their going out internationally, and that would help boost the economic growth as well. And certainly, I think for the quality economic development, we can't go away without talking about sustainability, and that's also a very important theme in enabling a lot of those in development in Guangdong, which we have a much bigger market to leverage on the offshore capability through bilateral lending or also bond issuance in supporting that development.
Thank you. I don't hear yet much evidence of deglobalization in the numbers from Manjiang or indeed your experience on the ground. Maybe we'll see it later, but at the moment it seems investors and business people are still following the money.
Yeah, I agree. Obviously, a lot of people did talk about like China Plus One on the supply chain, but that's actually triggered other development in terms of a lot of Chinese enterprises also going into like ASEAN. And building that trade connectivity, we can see the volume has been going up. We host a seminar for the Chinese enterprises, bring our 6 market CEO from the ASEAN to Shenzhen last month. It was very well received. They see the opportunity, they see the trend coming, and that's what foster more trade. I think the more open we have, the more international trade we have, we will see prosperity on both sides.
Thank you. Mr. He, we talked just now from Daniel, we just touched on sustainable finance, and I know that that's an area of focus for Shenzhen. Tell us how the sustainable finance scene is developing in Shenzhen.
我补充一点，刚才谈到大湾区，就前海一线里面跟香港机构会带来很多机会啊。 大湾区一我不知道30条大家认真研读过没有？就香港的所有类型的金融机构，鼓励它在深圳、前海设立相应的资管机构。目前我们都正在推动争取第一家能够尽快落地，并且大家刚才提到制度性的障碍里面，跨境的数据数据跨境是吧？金融数据跨境有一些障碍，但是在前海一件里面已经突破了，在集团内部的数据，一个集团内部在前海和香港之间可以实现跨境的那个传输，是吧？还有一个，以前很多在集团内部，香港的总部它的研究报告在内地是不能发放的，而这一次也有大的突破，对吧？还有一个，在前海的港资企业可以找香港的银行给予人民币贷款，最高500万，鼓励香港的中小企业的发展。所以我想是这个。当然，第二个呢，我想说，刚才咱们主持人就问到这个问题，大湾区实际上有很多已经开始合作了，比如说谈到的人才方面，金融科技师，那是我们19年3月份跟香港金管局、澳门金管局一起发起的，这是全球第一个有关金融科技领域的第一个专才计划。现在目前4年下来以后，我们1级持证人达到了2000个，2级持证人已经突破了200个。所以这个大湾区金融科技人才流动极其频繁，对业界特别给力。所以这个科技实现呢，我们包括明天我专门要开会，怎么把它推向国际，让更多的其他领域的来进行合作。金融科技在香港、深圳都是强项，是吧？目前香港正有37个大学生，我们跟香港财富局有个协议，正在深圳实习。因为深圳有一批巨型的金融科技企业做的都非常好，大家都清楚了包括微众银行，包括平安科技。平安科技它有11万人它的 PCT 的专利的申请量连续3年都是全球的第1位，它的人脸识别技术、虹膜技术、微表情技术在全球都是最领先的。当然，主持人特别谈到可持续金融，可持续金融大湾区有一个叫绿色金融联盟，这个秘书处就放在深圳。我是上一届联盟的主席，这一届联盟放在香港，主席是马俊，大家都认识的。所以我们在大湾区的绿色金融联盟里面，想在大湾区要做很多事情，包括我在5月份专门还到香港来参加过香港的部门之间专门有个联席会议，来探讨一些具体问题。比如说现在我们正在做的关于第三方认证，是吧？选出一些3方有协会来做这个事情，公布一个标准，选布一些机构，因为绿色、低碳是吧？零碳排放你不能自己说了算，必须有独立第三方。而独立第三方这个事情，在我们中国内地它属于行政许可部门是不能做的，是吧？除了国务院以外，是吧？其他部门各个部都不能进行行政许可，但是可以让协会来做。做完以后，选一批机构在大湾区执业，然后把这些机构通过市场的认可，来逐步走向其他地方，走向国际。所以这些可持续金融，我们深圳呢，也告诉大家，我们是全球第一个通过人大立法机构来进行对绿色金融进行专门立法的一个城市，要求我们深圳的所有的金融业的上市公司、发行过绿债的所有机构以及受过政府支持的机构，必须要进行环境信息披露，5000万以上的贷款必须进行环境投资的评估。在内部必须建立相应的管理制度，如果不这么做怎么办？让我们深圳金融局来进行执法，这个在全球是没有过的。所以绿色金融我们深圳也已经认定了30个专营机构，包括大湾区还有一点，深圳这几年每年都发行50亿，在香港发50亿绿债或者叫蓝色债，蓝色债就是海洋债，所以这些工作都在，也是可持续金融里面很重要的一部分。就是绿色金融。当然深圳还有另外一块做的也非常好，叫社会金融、社会影响力金融，是以金融的手段来解决社会问题。每年在我们深圳市政府的金融创新奖里面都有一大批这个社会影响力的案例向全球推广。我举个例子，比如说微信大家都在用，微信香港公司为了解决在香港大概有菲佣或马来西亚佣人大概有30多万人，他们以前的汇款是吧？排队6小时，汇款3天才到账。而微信下载一个 APP 以后，所有杂货店的费用由微信香港来进行承担，是吧？下载一个 APP 以后，大概这个几个小时是吧？5分钟就可以到账， 对吧？这就是以金融的手段来解决社会问题，所以这种案例现在越来越多。所以现在大家也知道，可持续发展2030可持续发展议程剩下了只有一半的时间了，是吧？以2015年提出 SDG 议程以后，所以这一方面，深圳我们也提出要打造全球的可持续金融中心，所以我们跟香港这方面的合作也非常多。
Thank you, Mr. He. You mention, Peter, Mr. He mentions this interesting intersection between sustainability and digital finance, and we'll draw that a little more. Sustainable finance is already a complex, heterogeneous market. How do you think that will work in the Greater Bay Area, as we've heard from these multiple jurisdictions, but a single economy? How do you think the green capital markets will work in that regard?
Sorry, me.
Yes.
Sorry. Right. Well, I think, Shenzhen, the mainland, will continue to have its own sustainable green finance agenda, and it will succeed very well at implementing that. And then offshore, Hong Kong will contribute by raising sustainable finance, sometimes in RMB, but probably more likely in US dollars, on behalf of those corporates that have treasury centers and have activities in Hong Kong or offshore. And we've seen evidence of that across the board. And I think there's another area where Hong Kong can really contribute to sustainable finance for China corporates, for mainland corporates, and that's in the area of voluntary carbon credits. So Loan mentioned Core Climate, which is the exchange set up by the Hong Kong Exchange to trade VCCs. And voluntary carbon credits are going to become an incredibly important component of the economy, but in particular for China, and particular for exporters. They are going to need access to internationally recognized voluntary carbon credits to be able to offset their emissions in order that they can continue to export into markets like the EU, certain states in the US, the UK, Britain, and Australia and New Zealand. And that's an area which is growing all the time. And Hong Kong should do what it's always done, which is act as the offshore provider of those credits.
Fair enough. Daniel, we touched also, Mr. He also touched on digital finance. China has led the world in that in many ways, both in terms of retail payments, WeChat and Alipay, but also in the introduction of a central bank digital currency. And we're going to explore that later with HKMA. As I mentioned, how do you see the advancement of digital finance in this multiple jurisdiction area? It seems like a key focus.
I think through a lot of digital means to distribute finance and modernize the way and make it more inclusive for a lot of the SMEs seems to be a key focus. I think also it's quite true that in mainland China, actually you have significantly more SMEs in the south than in the north. You probably have bigger companies. If you look at the supply chain, supply chain is everywhere in China, but in Guangdong area, you have basically 80% of those enterprises are in Guangdong. So that's give rises, and this cover across 300 different industry clusters. So the ability to finance them become more important. The other angle of looking at is also the proliferation of e-commerce. I think also it's a major, I think it's cover about 60% of export e-commerce actually coming from Guangdong area as well. I think the ability to provide financing to them using alternative data, both in mainland China and also offshore through Hong Kong, would be increasingly important, because they would, when they export through e-commerce, first is enable them to directly selling rather than always through a middleman, and also access to a much bigger market, but they would need to have a onshore and offshore. So I think that's where a lot of the collaboration with some of the platform, as well as banks together in the onshore and offshore will be important. So that's also an area that we've been quite focusing on, the e-commerce and enabling they receive money as local, and be able to pay the supply in China and continue to leverage on the bigger ecosystem in the Greater Bay Area to flourish.
Thank you. Does anyone have questions for the panel? I've got one or two questions more. I'd like in a moment to explore this idea with Peter of the similarities with the emergence of the EU. But does anyone have a question? Please. Microphone, please.
我有一个问题是问何局长的，所以我就直接用中文问了。因为我看到您刚才也提到，就是实际上今年1月份的时候，深圳有出台一个就是要支持这个深圳建设国际财富管理中心的这么一个意见。然后这个现在还比较 high level， 但是里面呢，我也注意到很有意思，因为我自己做资管，很多客户是国际的资管和投资机构。那您也提到，就是有一些目标，比方说这个几年之后需要在这个 PFM 啊，或者 QFLP、QDIE 这些国际资管机构达到一个什么样的量？那因为我是 base 在上海那其实上海呢，在这方面其实现在做的是还比较这个靠前，因为现在很多来中国的国际资管机构可能会选择在上海落户，他们也有一定的这个聚集效应，因为他会看他的 peers 之前选了哪儿。所以我在想，就是深圳如果怎么样发挥我们的这个后发优势，就是咱们会出一些什么具体的举措吗？就是来吸引这些机构。谢谢。
刚才我已经提到，深圳的财富管理的基础本身就占了中国的1/5。中国最大的银行理财公司在深圳，是吧？招银理财大概目前是2.7万亿人民币，这是最大的。包括你看所有银行理财子在深圳注册的没有上海多，但是你们可以发现我们管理的规模在中国整个市场里面都是居领先地位的。包括养老金呢，目前有11家有资格可以发养老金产品的，而我们深圳大概只有2家。它在全国的份额，你也可以就回去算一下，大概是一个什么样的比重。所以我想说是一个什么意思呢？包括深圳的金融机构，大家可以看到，目前一定程度上中国金融业好像有一些过剩，但是我们深圳的每个机构、头部机构、每一个类型的机构都在深圳。微众银行它一定是民营银行效益最好的，去年利润90亿，是吧？招商银行去年利润是1380亿。那是所有股份制银行效益最好的。中国消费金融公司有30家，我们最好的消费金融就是深圳的招联消费啊。券商他们来说，最大的券商是中信证券，中信证券就在深圳注册，是吧？我们深圳的券商的总资产、收入、利润，深圳市的券商在中国都是排第1位的。当然，我们还有国营租赁，对吧？还有华润信托，在他们细分领域里面都是排行很好的，这都是财富管理的机构。我们最近正在筹备了1年多，最近很快就会成立跨行业的财富和资产管理协会。当然，我们也会打通跟香港，我也邀请了香港那个瑞银理财的卢彩云，他也答应到我们那儿做一个副会长，所以我们这个都开始把这些打通了。所以财富管理，当然呢，还有一个我们要成立，就是我经常说一个金融的生态不能光靠政府，主要是业界，但是真正一个生态是4个字儿：政商学社。政府要有这个意识，业界要特别给力，学界也要跟上，社会组织也要跟上，是吧？刚才社会组织刚才已经说了，学界。目前北大有一个叫金理教授，在南科大当副校长，包括这周末他就有一本财富管理的书要进行课题的结题的论证，就每个细分行业就谈银行业，就因为财富管理有很多类型这些所有资管机构目前的发展，在中国的发展态势怎么样？你深圳的权重怎么样？下一步怎么去发展？所以这些工作我们都在努力做。当然呢，你也说到上海就如同是纽约，深圳好像又如同是旧金山，好像是任何外资机构如果不到纽约、到美国去布局如果第一个不布局在纽约，好像有点说不过去。但是纽约布局完以后，你下面还考虑到因为国家这么大，是吧？这个整个业态千变万化，所以我想说，深圳的市场化的力量是全国最强的，民营经济的比重是最高的，包括我们上市公司里面，我们深圳市 A 股上市公司里面跟上海不相上下。但是我们民营的比重达到了81%，包括世界500强，中国500强非常非常多， 我们在全中国各城市里头也是最多的，有7家之多，所以这是推动我们经济增长一个很好的一个动力啊，这个优势要继续发扬。
Thank you. Mr. Hu, I think, is saying there's enough business to go around between Shanghai and Shenzhen, I think, with China growing as it is. Any other questions from the audience? You, sir.
Yeah, hi, Simon Clark from Citibank. A couple of years ago, there was a big announcement about Wealth Connect in the GBA area and how it would allow mainland Chinese clients to invest in international markets. I must admit, I've heard nothing since. How's it going?
Who would like to take that? Daniel, Peter.
Okay, so the scheme, as I think Eddie said, this is started with baby step, but it's a major breakthrough because that's the first time you have retail investor. Right now, the utilization of the quota is relatively small. It's about 0.5% of the entire quota. It's involved quite a bit of complex issue, which I briefly mentioned. For example, the qualification of customers that can participate from a southbound angle. And also the products is also set at the kind of a low and medium risk. But actually a lot of the retail investor actually looking at higher return. So there's a bit of a mismatch. And also the quota is only set at 1 million RMB. So it seems to be targeted more as a mass affluent, but I think right now probably for those that have more experience investing in the internationally are actually from the high net worth, which they might see 1 million too small. So I think there are things which are under active discussion between banks and also the authorities on both sides. And I think HMA also came out and say that there will be certain relaxation coming forward very soon. So we'll look forward to those kind of relaxation.
Small steps in the right direction, it sounds like.
I agree with that. It was a relative conservative scheme when it was launched, and probably deliberately so, because it was the first time that there was a chink in the capital account for individuals. And don't forget, Wealth Management Connect is for individuals only. It's closed loop. So, of course, if you invest in Hong Kong product, when you sell it, you have to remit back to China, back to the mainland. And I think you're right. I think the issue with it is that it was pretty low risk, pretty unimaginative product. And what people are looking for is something which is slightly higher risk, slightly more volume, and perhaps less conservative. But my understanding, and you're probably closer to this, Daniel, than I am, is that the authorities are working on a sort of launch of Connect 2.0, which should be forthcoming to give this a little bit of extra boost.
Yeah. I think that should be coming pretty soon. I think apart from product expansion, I think the other thing would be more on like some of those consumer or investor education and how they are able to access the information on the other side. So if for southbound they want to know more about the Hong Kong products right now, there's restriction on cross-border marketing. So we can't market it from Hong Kong. But in China, we don't have a license for the Hong Kong banks to tell it. So I think they all recognize that. It's not easy for such an innovative scheme to begin with. So probably it's time to go beyond the baby step to have a further expansion.
Are you expecting a very gentle opening of the capital account?
I do not hear anything on that direction. Probably it will be still a particular kind of purpose to support all these. And I think there are various kind of discussion or feedback about if you have more Hong Kong people going back to live in mainland cities in GBA, then I mean, if they want to buy property and when they sell, can they take the money out? All these are, I think, under a lot of interest. That's the kind of soft regulatory alignment that we need. Just like now we have breakthrough in driving a Hong Kong car into China. That's need to overcome apart from the regulation. Also like the insurance liability and all that. So let's take a bit of a deliberation, but I think it will be gradually movement and in the right direction.
Okay. Final question from the audience. If anyone's got a question.
我再补充一句话。
Okay.
今年全国3月份政协大会期间，我作为政协委员专门写了个题，优化跨境通理财机制，跨境理财通的有关机制。刚才说了很多原因，很多问题。 是吧？不能跨境投资顾问是吧？包括一定要见面才能开户是吧？这个门槛相对比较高等等是吧？还有一个目前只能银行做，下一步怎么办是吧？这个材料都是公开的，可以再看一下啊。我们都在继续推动这个事情优化啊。
Final question from the audience from anyone? You, sir.
Thank you, Stuart James, Goldman Sachs. There was an announcement yesterday on an MOU on data to underpin cross-border service provision in the GBA. And this, of course, is in the context of quite a new rules on data and what can be stored and exchanged for by firms on the mainland going externally. So I wondered if any of the panel would like to talk about how important that is, what they know about how it's going to work.
Peter, this is where the rubber really hits the road, this kind of thing. What do you expect on harmonization of data flows and standards in multiple jurisdictions in the GBA?
Well, first of all, I should declare an interest. I'm indebted to Stuart, who I met in the corridor just earlier, and we discussed this. So I'm not sure if this is a planted question or not, but in any case, let me have a go of it. So look, I mean, I'm going to wrap that into your question, which I think is coming about the EU.
Why don't we do that? Exactly.
Because the two are connected. So I'm aware of the extreme irony of me, a British citizen, talking about the great achievements of the EU. But I remain, to be just a little bit political for a moment, a staunch supporter of the EU and wish that the United Kingdom was still a member. Setting that aside, when the single market was created in the EU, there was talk about what was called the four freedoms, the four freedom of movements. So it was the freedom of movement of goods, freedom of movement of people, the freedom of movement of services, and the freedom of movement of capital. And when the outline development plan for GBA was first launched, my understanding is there were meetings with the EU between authorities in the GBA on the mainland and Hong Kong to really understand how these four freedoms work. And ultimately, that has to be the objective of the GBA, to get those four freedoms so that people, services, goods, and capital can move freely between them. And if we got to that outcome, then we would have a great result. But let's look at those. So if you start with the freedom of movement of goods, we're sort of pretty well there. I mean, goods can move in and out of the mainland from Hong Kong, being able to do that under SEPA for some time. So we're sort of pretty well there. It's happening with little or no friction. Freedom of movement of people, there's a little bit of friction. Someone like myself needs a visa or an APAC card. I know that if you're a Hong Kong citizen, then you don't. And there's even been talk about creating a sort of GBA card, which would allow people to come in and out without a passport. But, people can move in and out and around the region relatively easily. It's possible now for Hong Kong citizens to get jobs relatively easily in the mainland, and indeed in some places to continue to pay Hong Kong tax, which is not an unimportant consideration. But visas are, broadly speaking, still required. It's a little bit more complicated than goods. Services. So this is where we hit the data question. So services really require a transfer of data. So you need to be able to analyze data. If you're working in Hong Kong in a consultancy capacity, on a consultancy in China, you need access to that data, and you do need to be able to analyze it, and you need to represent it. At the moment, that is a very difficult thing to do because data is a national security issue in many cases, and so it has to stay on shore. In China, equally in Hong Kong, it's a separate legal and economic system, so the data in Hong Kong should be ring-fenced. So it's very difficult to move that data back and forth. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it's very difficult to do that. Now, this MOU that Stuart has referred to is, I think, a step forward because it refers to the ability to now move to a situation where data can be more freely shared. the question is, how do you preserve? So there's still, I think, a lot of flesh to be put on the bones. The question is, how do you preserve the integrity of the two systems? Make sure that you don't have leaks of what is deemed to be national security issues, or the integrity of the Hong Kong system where data can be easily and readily accessed from the mainland. So still, I think, a fair bit of work to do because you've got two different economic and legal systems operating there. But I think this is a step in the right direction. And the fourth freedom, just to finish off, is the freedom of movement of capital. And that is very difficult at the moment because we have a closed capital account in China. And until that is eased, which would mean that capital could flow easily around the world, which I think is extremely unlikely in the short or medium term, I don't think you're going to have free capital account. The response has been the Connect schemes. So the Connect schemes have been a way of providing lacunae in that system to allow capital to come into Hong Kong and of course Hong Kong capital go into China in a relatively frictionless way.
Thank you. And the EU instance shows that this stuff is very difficult. There's still no capital markets union really in the EU, though they try, and certainly not a banking union, even though there's a monetary union already. So these things are difficult. We're out of time, and I'd love you to get on to networking over lunch. So I wanted to thank the panel for this very interesting tour around an extremely intriguing economic concept, which I'm sure is going to grow and grow. So thank you very much to my panelists, and come back this afternoon to hear about more on capital markets and indeed on crypto assets, tokenization and CBDC, which we'll look into later. So join us after lunch. Thank you.